So this month's webinar series is covering floodplain development scenarios, practical examples for community officials. I know we have more than just community officials on this call, but this is an opportunity for us to kind of walk through some more of the common situations in the floodplain where community officials need to look at their regulations and see kind of what steps they need to go through to make sure that the development complies with their floodplain regulations. So again, my name is Jennifer Gilbert. I am the State Floodplain Management Coordinator. I've been in this role for 16 years now. I am also the Director of the Office of Planning and Development, and I've been in that role for 7 years now. As you may remember, we used to be part of the Office of Strategic Initiatives. That agency is no longer there, and we are now here at the New Hampshire Department of Business and Economic Affairs as the new Office of Planning and Development. So we welcome you to today's webinar. This is a brief agenda of what I'll be going through. Just a very brief overview of the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program. If you haven't been a part of our floodplain webinars in the past, this will be a kind of a helpful starting point. Also with this webinar, I'll be going through some of these floodplain development scenarios. We kind of left this to an hour and a half, so there's a lot to know about the floodplain program, about the National Flood Insurance Program. So I certainly can't cover everything. We have done some basic floodplain 101 webinars, and they are available on our website, on our training website. And you can, if you find that there's a topic that I'm talking about that I don't go into a lot of detail, chances are you'll be able to find that in there. We also have a really great resource training module on floodplain mapping basics. So I'll be referring to that during the presentation as well, but that's a great overview about floodplain mapping, how to use it, and the tools that are involved with that. We'll then kind of wrap up with the resources and again, time for questions and answers at the end. All right. So quick overview of the Quick overview of the NFIP. It was created back in 1968, so it's a 53-year-old program. It's come a long way. Some things have changed, some things not so much. It's a voluntary partnership between FEMA and participating communities. Communities agree to adopt and enforce certain floodplain regulations, and in return, FEMA offers NFIP flood insurance to all communities that participate. And the insurance is then available to all residents within that community. The NFIP is an important program here in New Hampshire. Flooding is the #1 disaster in New Hampshire. Just this summer, we had 2 disaster declarations for severe storms and flooding from the events in Cheshire and Sullivan counties. Certainly Grafton County has been struggling with some flooding in the last couple of years as well. And coastal New Hampshire is also experiencing very frequent flooding, and it's not even related to storms anymore. The NFIP is basically comprised of 3 parts. It's about the floodplain mapping, so knowing your risk. By looking at the maps, you're recognizing what the potential risk is. The floodplain regulations are there to help reduce people's risks when they build in the floodplain. And flood insurance is there to help insure the risk that is there in the floodplain, and as well as outside of the floodplain. So there's a couple different roles involved with the National Flood Insurance Program. Obviously, FEMA, it's their program. They have program oversight. They identify the risk through their mapping program. They establish the guidelines. They monitor community compliance with the program, and they also make, again, the flood insurance available to all the residents in the communities that participate. At the state level, our role is really to provide technical assistance to all stakeholders. We provide education and outreach like we are doing today. We've developed model floodplain regulations for communities to use. And then we also assist communities with evaluating the compliance of their floodplain activities, and also assist with post-disaster activities. But the biggest role by far lies with the communities themselves. Communities, again, have to adopt and enforce regulations. So there's a need to understand what those regulations are and the floodplain maps for those communities. There needs to be a process in place for permitting all development in a special flood hazard area and enforcing that. So it's about the issuing of the permits and ensuring that the development meets the requirements of the community's floodplain regulations. And in some cases, needing to take action, again, enforcement action when violations are addressed. This shows the map of the communities that currently participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. We have 93% of the communities that participate, and those are shown in white. The ones shown in orange and yellow are the ones that currently do not participate. We do have 2 communities that are indicated in orange right now that have an interest in joining. So what this means is throughout all the white area, those are communities that participate and have adopted and enforced floodplain regulations. It also means flood insurance is also available in all those white communities. So just a reminder that anywhere it can rain, anywhere it rains, it can flood. So right now we're about approximately 7,000 flood insurance policies in place in the state. And that includes both policies, both in and out of the floodplain. The community's floodplain regulations are a key part of their participation. Again, they've been adopted and enforced as part of their participation in the program. Many communities have adopted standards that go above the minimum standards of the NFIP, which is great because the minimum standards only can do so much. But a community really needs to decide, what those regulations are that they need. Every community has different levels of risk when it comes to flooding. So we always encourage them to have an ordinance that reflects that actual risk within that community. And one thing to note is our state building code that went into effect in 2019, in which the state adopted the I-codes from 2015. That came along with about 75% of the NFIP requirements is required through our state building code too. These codes include many provisions that actually exceed the minimum NFIP requirements. So we always talk to communities about that enforce the state building code to kind of look at their regulations in their floodplain ordinance and just seeing where the state building code and their regulations in their floodplain ordinance can be more consistent. Because when the 2015 codes came out, it did require that the lowest floor of structures be elevated 1 foot, at least 1 foot above base flood elevation. Certainly, non-residential structures, there's a different requirements based on the type of building. But there is at least a 1 foot freeboard requirement that lowest floor be above. The minimum standards of the NFIP, which a lot of communities have adopted, requires an elevation at base flood elevation. So just be aware that if you do enforce the state building code, just take a look at your ordinance and just see how it compares with what's in the code. All right, and obviously the floodplain maps are a big part of the program as well. So as I go through the scenarios, I'm going to be referencing the FEMA maps, which show the 1% annual chance floodplain, which the old term for that is the 100-year floodplain. There's also the term that I'll be using throughout the presentation called Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. So that all refers to the same thing. Other features that on the map that I'll be referencing is also the base flood elevation, which are associated with zone AE and A1 through 30. The BEFE is the height above mean sea level that the 1% annual chance flood is expected to rise to. So that's the standard that's being used as to how structures are to be elevated with their lowest floor. The other feature that I'm going to be highlighting on maps is the floodway portion of the floodway. That's a special feature that I'll be talking about during some of the scenarios. We do have a couple communities in the state that do not have any map floodplain areas, so their regulations are slightly different. They deal more with flood-prone areas. But the maps have certainly come a long way since they first started. This is pretty much an example of an example from a map from the early 70s. Unfortunately, we still have a couple of these in the state and mainly in Belknap County. Unfortunately, Belknap County was the only county that did not go through an update when FEMA updated for county level mapping and digital mapping. But there is a mapping process in place. So if you're in Belknap County, hopefully these maps will be going away in the next few years. In 2005, FEMA initiated what they call the Modernization Program. This is the program that took the community-wide maps and made them into county-wide maps. They also digitized them. So all the state of New Hampshire has digitized floodplain areas, which is available through Granite. It's also available through FEMA's Map Service Center. Again, Belknap does not have digital maps, but the rest of the state does at this point. And just recently, in 2015 and 2021, our coastal communities received new mapping, and this is a look at what the new mapping looks like. It's much better. It's not doesn't have the pixel or the dotting that the current maps have. So it just makes it a more clear overlay. As I mentioned before, I'll be talking about the floodway. This red striped area is considered the floodway portion of the floodplain. So I'll be talking more about that. And as I mentioned before, there's new mapping going on right now all around the state, and those will be coming out over the next several years. We're possibly 5 years out for some areas, and some could be coming into effect within the next 2 years. But our office will certainly keep everybody informed about the new maps and as they come out. All right, so we're going to first talk quickly about the Floodplain Toolbox. So for communities to be successful and to maintain good standing in the FIP, a community really needs to have a good floodplain toolbox with certain tools to help manage floodplain development. Floodplain, the staff at the community level that deals with the floodplain stuff is obviously important. They're kind of the go-to people when people have questions about floodplains or understanding those floodplain regulations. And that role at the community level it varies throughout the state. It can be the building inspector, it could be the select board, it could be a land use coordinator, it could be an administrative assistant. That's kind of the go-to person. In general, FEMA refers to these people as the floodplain administrator. That is the person to go to at the community if they need to find out more information about what's going on in the floodplain. And we recognize that at different levels of the communities that we have in the state, the amount of floodplain development that's going on, you could have some communities that are doing this a lot, dealing with floodplain development, and then other communities that maybe get 1 or 2 permits every several years. But it's important to keep up on the training because things are constantly changing, and that's where we're trying to make it as easy as possible for everybody to get training. So that's a key part of the floodplain toolbox is the staff itself. Having some kind of floodplain administrative procedures is also important. As I've seen over the years with communities struggling with limited staff, changeover in staff, and just trying to be consistent from property owner or just the communities themselves being consistent from one community department to another. There's certain administrative procedures that really should be written down so that when you do have staff turnover, somebody new can come in and just start working from where the community had been before. Some of these processes include, how do you How do you make floodplain determinations of whether or not someone needs to apply for a permit or need to comply with the regulations, and who is doing that? We're going to be talking a lot about substantial improvement and substantial damage. You know, how is that being done? Who is doing that? Who's going to make that determination? When you're dealing with areas that have base flood elevations, you're not always going to be on a cross section to know what that base flood elevation is supposed to be for a particular structure. So how is there a process to determine that base flood elevation? So we have sample administrative procedures. We have a fact sheet that goes with it about best management practices. If you're interested in doing that, I encourage you to look at our website. That's available, and we'd be happy to work with you on that. Another tool is a mapping tool, making those floodplain determinations. Taking a look at those hard copy maps are very painful. They're not easy to see. There are a lot of online viewers now, including our New Hampshire Flood Hazard Viewer. So if you don't have an internal source, mapping tool source, we encourage you to take a look at the New Hampshire Flood Hazard Viewer. If you just put that in an internet search, you'll be able to find it. It includes parcel level data if it's available, which it is in most communities. So you can just type in an address and it should take you to the location where you're interested in, and it will show you all the information that you need. Another tool is having a floodplain permit in place to cover not only building development, but non-building development. Many communities use their existing building permit form, which is perfectly okay, especially for the building permit or for building development. But there's going to be cases where you may have somebody proposing something that is not related to a building. So you just need to ask yourself, is your building permit application going to be sufficient for these non-building development proposals? Substantial improvement, substantial damage procedures. This goes along with the floodplain administrative procedures, but I kind of brought this out because this can be a whole different thing. Substantial improvement, as I will be talking about, is when somebody is improving a structure. Substantial damage is when something has been damaged by something. And especially a widespread flood event, if your community is impacted, you're going to have many different houses that are going to need determinations made. And just having those process and procedures in place before a flood event is going to be extremely helpful and less stressful. So I highly encourage communities to think about how they're going to do that. How are they going to get the resources they need to do these determinations? Having a floodplain resource library so that when you do get questions or you do have a proposal, there is a lot of FEMA guidance out there. The regulations themselves and the ordinance just hit on what the requirements are, but there's so much more detail out there. The Floodplain Management Program website at our office has a lot of those resources, so I encourage you to bookmark that. And just having, there's sometimes FEMA Publication Warehouse has a lot of the publications in hard copy too. So if you want hard copies, you can easily order those for free as well. And reach out to me if you would like some assistance with that. I'd be happy to help. And speaking of that, just the State Floodplain Program staff here as well. We're here to help. We're here to help the communities be successful. So please reach out to us for anything. We're part of the toolbox for making sure that you're successful in your community. All right, so enough of that. Let's get into the floodplain scenarios themselves. All right, so we have kind of a welcome to Graniteville. So you're a community official within Graniteville. Graniteville participates in the NFIP, and the required NFIP language has been adopted in the community's floodplain ordinance and to its subdivision and site plan regulations. Several Graniteville residents are interested in developing their land and have contacted you to understand the requirements that apply. So we'll move on to development scenario 1, which is probably one of the more common ones. It's dealing with New construction. So we're just going to start out with property owner Errol Hollis is planning to build a new residential building on his property. Will your community's floodplain regulations apply for this development? So we've got the site of the proposed building shown there in a red box, and we have the outline of his parcel, and we have it overlaid on top of the FEMA floodplain layer. So you can see that it's located in Zone 8E. So what is the guess on that? And I know you can't say anything. If you want to participate by chat, certainly welcome to do that. But for this question, will your community's floodplain regulations apply for this development? And the answer is yes, it will. And I got one yes. Correct. The site of the proposed building is located in Zone AE in the special flood hazard area. Therefore, your community's floodplain regulations do apply. So that's why it's important to for the community to make their floodplain determination, because you need to know whether or not somebody needs to comply with your community's floodplain regulations, whether or not they need a permit. All right, so you know now that this proposal is located in a floodplain. It's going to need a permit. So what do you need to do during the permitting process? You need to know what flood zone is. The flood zone determines what regulations will apply in your regulations. There are going to be times when you're going to possibly deal with a structure that straddles two flood zones. So you need to know that that the flood zone that's more restrictive or is the one that's going to rule. A lot of cases when you're dealing with, especially in the coastal areas, if you're dealing with a zone VE, which is one directly along the coast, where you have wave action, where you have something like AE, if somebody is straddling those two zones, the VE is going to be more restrictive. So that's the zone that you're going to have to go with. The regulations related to that zone is going to rule how the structure is going to be built. Because this property includes a floodway, it's also very important to understand whether or not any proposal for development is going to be occurring in that floodway. We're going to be talking more about a scenario about something that happens in the floodway, and it's very important to know because there's much more restrictive requirements that happen in the floodway. If there's a base flood elevation determined for the special flood hazard area, you're going to need to know what that base flood elevation is. And our floodplain mapping basic recording, as well as our floodplain 101, kind of goes into the steps of how you determine that base flood elevation, because you're going to need to know that to know how high they need to be. For that last bullet is, what is their proposed elevation of that lowest floor? Is it going to meet that requirement that's in your ordinance? So these are all the things that you kind of need to walk through to know what to request from the applicant to ensure that they're going to comply with the regulations. So what are some other requirements in the community's floodplain regulations that will apply for this new structure? Flood damage resistant building materials. The building must be dry flood proofed. All other necessary federal and state permits have been received, or is it both A and C? Right. So the answer is it's A and C. Flood damage resistant materials, that's one of the requirements. Needing to get other necessary federal and state permits as part of the floodplain permit is also a requirement. The building that must be dry flood proofed, that is a requirement, but that's only for non-residential structures, which we'll get into a little bit more detail. So just some general construction requirements that come along with new construction and substantial improvements. Again, we mentioned the flood resistant materials, but it's also the utilities, making sure that they're designed or located to prevent water from entering them or accumulating in them. One of the biggest requirements regarding the floodplain regulations is that lowest floor. That lowest floor also includes a basement. So whatever that lowest floor is, that has to be at or above that base flood elevation, whatever your requirement in your ordinance is. A lot of communities do enforce a freeboard, which means they go 1 or 2 feet above base flood elevation, so it's important to remember that. Again, I mentioned zone VE, wave action. You don't want the waves hitting against a foundation wall. So those structures are required to be up on piles, piers, or columns. So there's requirements there as well. Non-residential structures, as I mentioned, they can be dry flood proof. They have 2 options really, either elevated up to that base flood elevation, or they have to be dry flood proofed up to that base flood elevation. So they essentially have to be watertight. The water cannot get into the building, but that's only an option for non-residential structures. So many times, in order to get that lowest floor up to that base flood elevation or up to that required level, you need to a lot of times people will use an enclosure, a fully walled enclosure to help get that floor up to that level that it needs to be. These enclosures are allowed to be below that base flood elevation as long as they meet criteria as detailed in the regulations. So this question is, what is that criteria that the enclosure has to meet if it's below that lowest floor and below that base flood elevation? Is it the floor of the enclosure must be at or above the lowest adjacent grade? Is it the enclosure can only be used for parking, access, or storage? Or is it a required number of flood openings are required in the enclosure walls? Or is it all of the above? The answer is it's all of the above. Those are the 3 criteria that the enclosures have to meet in order for that lowest floor, for that structure to be compliant. In coastal VE zones, these enclosures are not allowed. As I said, you've got wave action. You cannot have fully walled foundation walls underneath. Breakaway walls are allowed, but they need, as they say, they need to break away. But they have the same requirement, parking, access, or storage only for down there. So enclosures are one of the most frequent violations that are seen with development in the floodplain. Something usually happens, either it's not enough flood openings are in the enclosure walls, or the floor of that enclosure is below grade on all sides. That in the NFIP world is considered a basement and not allowed. So just pay special attention to those enclosures because that is where a lot of the violations occur. And it can really have implications insurance-wise on the property owner and can cause compliance issues for the community as well. Another frequent violation is mechanical and equipment. Do not keep any of that. That really needs to be above base flood elevation. It cannot be in these enclosures because that can cause issues as well. All right, so with scenario 1, I'm kind of going a little bit deeper into the permitting process and the enforcement process, which I won't get into in the other ones, but they're certainly applicable for the other scenarios. I just won't be getting into that level of detail. But so back to scenario 1, the community has confirmed that the proposed development will meet the requirements of the ordinance and a permit is issued. Now what? Does the community have an inspection process? I know that a lot of communities in New Hampshire don't, especially if you don't have a building inspector. But what happens if you don't have an inspection process or a building inspector to do that? You know, kind of what are the options to help ensure that that structure being built is what it was being done, is being done as it was permitted for. I've worked with several communities that have permitted it. They let the applicant go. They've built it and things have changed. It's not how it was permitted and they get themselves in trouble because it's not, it doesn't comply with the regulations. So just trying to figure out what works best for your community. I think I heard one community has their fire official going out to do fire inspections, and then while they're out, they're also checking on some of the floodplain development that's going on, just taking pictures and bringing it back to the office for people that are working on the permitting piece, just to see what the progress is. So there's ways to do it. And, again, we'd be happy to work with the community on doing that. Community must obtain and maintain as-built elevation data at a minimum as part of their participation in the program. It's stated in the ordinance. The best thing is to require a FEMA elevation certificate, which is a form that's already set up to gather this elevation data. And it can benefit the property owner as well, because they can use it to get a flood insurance rating, or for other purposes as well. So then the question is do you have a process in place to help get people to come back to you to submit this as-built elevation? Again, I know the different levels that each community is working with. Some have a certificate of occupancy requirement, certificate of compliance requirement, and some don't have any of that. So how do you get people to come back to you? Because you need to maintain that information on file. So there's a couple different ways that they can, communities can do that. One of the things that we've developed is an agreement to submit post-construction floodplain development documentation. It's a form that the property owner has to sign as part of the whole permitting process. It's basically them agreeing that they're going to come back and give you that as-built elevation data. And if they don't, now you have something in writing saying that they would. And if they don't, you have something to go on. All right, so that finishes up scenario one. New construction, it's just a matter of making sure you get that permit, making sure you understand what they're proposing, that what they build is compliant. And then when they submit the as-built information, it's making sure, it's reviewing that as-built information and making sure it complies with your floodplain regulations. Again, with this program, if it's not built correctly, there's insurance implications that come back to the property owners, and there's also potential compliance issues that come with the community as well. So let's go into development scenario two. Do we have any questions so far? I don't see anything in the chat just yet, but feel free to put in the chat any questions that come up. All right, scenario number two. It's another common floodplain development scenario. So in this case, we have Meredith Jackson, a property owner who is proposing to perform improvements in her existing house, which was originally built in 1964. You have confirmed that the house is located in Zone AE of the Special Flood Hazard on the FEMA map. The building, they confirm, is not located in the floodway. There is a floodway across the street, but it does not affect this property at all. So you can see the arrow points to the existing structure. The question I also get a lot is, if half the house is in the floodplain, does only half the house have to comply with the regulations? And that is not true. If any portion of a structure is located in a special flood hazard area as shown on the map, or if it can be mapped showing the base flood elevation on actual contour data, if any portion of that property or structure is in the special flood hazard area, then the entire structure has to comply with the floodplain regulations. All right, so a question for you guys. Whose responsibility is it to make a substantial improvement determination? Does it fall on FEMA? Does it fall on me, the state? Is it the applicant that has to make that decision, or is it the community? That is correct. It's D. It is ultimately the community's responsibility to make a determination whether or not a proposed changes are a substantial improvement. The applicant is responsible for furnishing all that information to you. All the total cost of the work, including labor. FEMA has a really great resource, Substantial Improvement, Substantial Damage Desk Reference. That's the one I continue to use. I use it frequently. It has a lot of the information that you need to know, including all of the costs that need to be included and what costs can be excluded. So highly recommend looking into that if you're dealing with substantial improvement. So the goal of bringing substantial improvement structures into compliance is because a certain amount of investment money is going into this structure already. So to make it more flood resistant, because at the time this house was built was before the community had floodplain regulations, before the floodplain mapping. So they didn't have anything to go on. They weren't being regulated. There was no map to say they were in the floodplain. So as much as it's hard to deal with substantial improvements, you're doing the property owner a favor by, if they meet that criteria, to get them to at least the minimum standards of the NFIP, because it will further protect them in the end. It can certainly, if it's determined to be substantial improvement and it's not brought into compliance with the ordinance, it can certainly, again, have insurance implications, especially if someone files a claim. There can be some issues there. It can also compromise the community's standing in the NFIP.
Hey Jen, this is Mike. So no questions. There's some comments that people are liking this, but I did have a question actually. I jotted it down when you were going on the intro slide with the capital floodplain administrator position, and this relates to the last slide where the community was in charge. Now, when you say community is in the floodplain regs, is there a defined person or position who does interpret this? And maybe you can detail exactly what you mean by community, and is it the floodplain administrator, and is that position defined by statute or by ordinance?
Yep, good question. So in community's floodplain ordinance, there is a specific community official that is designated throughout the ordinance. Again, usually it's referenced, the building inspector that's used throughout. In communities that don't have building inspectors, like we have several communities in which it's the Board of Selectmen that are responsible for issuing permits. So the floodplain ordinance references the Board of Selectmen. And I know that in those communities, sometimes they have a designee. So it says Board of Selectmen or designee, which can vary as well. I know just working from communities, there's a lot of, sometimes there's more than one person, but there's at least one person designated in the ordinance, and that traditionally is the floodplain administrator. So.
Thank you.
Okay, so what exactly is substantial improvement, substantial damage? And just to preface this, we've done complete webinars on substantial improvement and substantial damage. So those are available. I'm going to just touch on the surface of this, but certainly if you have more questions or interests, we have those available for more detail. So when somebody is improving, want to improve something, you need to look at the total cost of those improvements. This is not only just within the existing footprint, but it can be with, so if somebody is just renovating something within the existing structure and the existing footprint, that potentially could be a substantial improvement. Certainly if they're gutting everything and starting new, but keeping the framing. It can also include an addition. So if those total costs are equal to or greater than 50% of the market value of the structure before the start of the construction, then that's considered a substantial improvement. And if it's determined to be a substantial improvement, it has to be brought into compliance as if it was new construction with the requirements in the ordinance. And this is a determination that is made by the community. So again, it can be remodeling within the existing footprint. It could be lateral additions, vertical additions. And then we'll also touch a little bit on this too, is the repair of substantial damage as well. So if that structure is damaged and the repairs may constitute a substantial damage as well. So the ordinance references substantial improvements, but doesn't talk about how you administer substantial improvements and how you make determinations. This is kind of where those written procedures are strongly recommended, because you want to be fair to all property owners, that you're doing the same process for every property owner. And again, if you have staff that change, you want to make sure that whatever system was in place continues on, to make it fair for everybody. So administering substantial improvement requires 4 major actions. It's determining what that market value is. A lot of communities in New Hampshire use the current assessed value of just the structure. Does not include land, it's just the structure. Determining what those total improvement costs are. Then making that substantial determination, and then requiring those property owners to bring that structure into compliance with the ordinance. So again, I'm just touching briefly on this. We've done trainings that go into a lot more detail about this. And then just to help communities as well with this whole process, we recently released a substantial damage application packet and property owner guide earlier this year. It's really to assist both community officials and property owners of what is required during this process, because it is quite the process. So it just keeps everybody on the same page, so everybody knows what is required and why it's required. So that's available on our website. We have that link, as well as the slides I should have mentioned, on our website, on our floodplain training, on our planning and zoning training page. All right, so back to our scenario. You have performed the substantial improvement. The cost of the improvements equal 32% of the market value of the structure. Will the improvements constitute a substantial improvement? And the answer is no, that's correct. It needs to be at that 50% level. So just to follow up on that, since the work will not be a substantial improvement, Meredith's project is exempt from all the requirements in your community's floodplain ordinance. Is that true or false? If the work is not considered a substantial improvement, that is false, correct? So while the requirements to bring it into compliance, fully into compliance with the ordinance is not there, it is still a development in the special flood hazard area, so it requires a permit. It may require some other requirements, but it would not need to be fully brought into full compliance. So that's correct. All right, so moving on to scenario 3. We have Meredith Jackson again, same property owner, but different situation. Is proposing to perform repairs to her existing house, which was originally built in 1964, again, and recently experienced damage from a fire. The community has confirmed that the house is located in Zone AE, not in the floodway. So if the structure is damaged by a fire and is located in a special flood hazard area, would a substantial damage determination be required as part of the? Yes, it would be. The definition of substantial damage means damage of any origin. So this gets a little confusing, because I've worked with property owners that just didn't understand they had a fire, but yet they're having to comply with the floodplain regulations. And it's strictly just because, again, the property is located, or the structure is located in a special flood hazard area. It has a risk of flooding. There's a substantial amount of investment or money going into this property to repair it. Let's just go ahead and bring it into compliance with the ordinance as well, to help minimize that damage. Last thing you want to do is have somebody have a fire, rebuild, and then get damaged results of a flood. So you've reported the substantial damage determination. The cost of the repairs is 62% of the structure. So the existing structure must be brought into compliance with the floodplain ordinance as if it was new construction. So it's similar to the substantial improvement determination. You're looking at the total repair cost divided by the pre-damage structure value and whether or not that meets 50% or more. Bringing structures into compliance, if you've ever had to do this, is not an easy thing, and it can vary greatly, structure by structure, for various reasons. Where that lowest floor of that structure is can make a huge difference. If it's a slab on grade, it's much easier to deal with to bring it into compliance to get that floor to that base elevation or to the required elevation. If somebody has a basement, that is going to be much more of a challenge, especially depending on what's in that basement. Because if you have an existing structure that's substantially improved, substantially damaged, that basement's going to need to be filled, because you cannot have an area below grade on all sides, which is considered a basement. You need to fill that so that it's up to a level to it's at least at grade. These can be hard conversations with property owners because financial hardship, various reasons with the house, it can be hard. But in the end, we're taking a structure that's really at risk and reducing its risk greatly. Substantial damage can also be challenging, as I mentioned before, if you have a large-scale flood event and you're having to do these substantial damage determinations for several structures. After flood events, people are ready to clean up and they're ready to get on with their lives and to repair the house. So things can happen quickly. So communities just really need to have a process in place of how they're going to deal with, especially a large amount of structures that are damaged. So, and again, just the need to be consistent and fair from property to property. So again, check out those other training webinars that I mentioned. They'll be real big help. All right, moving on to development scenario number 4. All right, so we have Mr. Warren. A property owner is proposing to place a large amount of fill on a portion of his property. You've determined that the development site is located in Zone A, which is one that does not have a base flood elevation, within a special flood hazard area. Raymond says he's never experienced flooding on his property in the last 30 years, and that is great. So here's the site of the proposed fill placement. Not sure what he's planning to do with all the fill, but he's putting a large amount of fill, and it's in the floodplain. So if he's never experienced flooding, why does it matter he's put in some fill in the floodplain? Because when it does flood, it can potentially cause an adverse impact on neighboring properties. It could potentially divert the water. The fill could divert the water onto another property where if the fill wasn't there, that wouldn't have happened. It could also dislodge the fill and just take all that amount of fill and take it downstream and cause issues down there. So the placement of fill anywhere is a concern, especially a substantial amount of fill, so you really need to take a look at it. So this is where I get into what do you do when you have a proposed non-building development in the floodplain? How do you permit for this? What is your process? Because as it states in the ordinance, all proposed development in a special area requires a local permit. And FEMA's requirement for this is just so that community is aware of what is happening in the floodplains. Sometimes it can be a very minor issue and may not need a permit. If you're putting a mailbox in, certainly there's some common sense that that will not cause an issue in the floodplain. But certainly there's other things that can happen, that can go on in the floodplain that can cause problems, especially for neighboring property owners. So the community might not know what's going on unless you have a permit process in place to capture all these. So if the applicant does, and certainly understanding that you're going to have property owners that may not understand the regulations, may not know about the permit. So certainly public outreach to your residents is helpful. But knowing that if someone does do something in the floodplain without a permit from the community, that is considered a violation and something that should be addressed. again, there can be a wide variety of issues relating to developments from something very minor to something very large. So it's not so black and white, but it is something to be aware of. So what will Raymond need to do to submit to you as part of the permit process prior to placing the fill? A, a completed permit application. B, any other required state or federal permits. C, A and B, or no permit is required for this development. That is correct. It's C, A and B. So development in the floodplain is going to require that permit. The requirement of any state or federal permits. So we're talking about, DES certainly, if there's wetlands, shoreland, alteration of terrain, this can all play into this as well. Some other examples, so I did an example of fill, but there are a lot of other examples of non-building related development. Fences are one thing, and I know that there's some exemptions in communities as far as fencing. Fencing can be a really big issue, especially in a floodway. So that is something, especially a stockade fence, that can essentially act as a barrier and could cause some real significant issues. Sewer and water systems, we have existing neighborhoods that were built long ago that are still there, that have been mapped into the floodway. If a new septic system needs to go in, or if fill is needed to bring in for the septic system and it's in the floodway, I'm jumping ahead. If it's in a floodplain, it's going to require a permit to know what's going on. Watercourse alteration is another piece that's in the floodplain ordinance. So if someone is proposing changing the course of a watercourse, there are requirements included as well. So again, just listing off some of the things that may come up in your community that are non-building related that are going to need to be addressed as part of the floodplain ordinance. Also, ground-mounted solar arrays is another one. I've been getting a lot of those in the last few years too. All right, so I'm not seeing questions, so I don't know if I'm addressing all your questions, but I will keep moving on and certainly available afterwards. So scenario, property owner Alexandria Fitzwilliam wants to build a new house on her land, and she wants it by the river because we like the water views. Unfortunately, the proposed location has been determined to be in Zone A, E, and in the floodway. So I should preface that not all communities in the state have a floodway. So if you're thinking, I don't know anything about this floodway requirement, it's possible that you don't have a floodway on your community's floodplain map. But if you do, so what the floodway is it's an area of the floodplain that is going to be where when the 1% chance flood happens, it's the area of the floodplain that has the deepest and fastest moving water. So that is a place that you don't want to live. You don't want to be, and an understanding that we have a lot of existing structures that were built before these maps were built that are in these areas. But moving forward, we want to keep that floodway free of obstructions as possible so that the water can discharge safely without causing issues. So because of this importance of this floodway being free of encroachments, there's much more restrictive requirements that come with a floodway. So the proposal of a building in a floodway certainly causes that regulation to come into play. And this is the regulation that occurs. No development is allowed unless an engineering analysis provided by the applicant shows the proposed development would not cause any increase in the base flood elevation. So what is happening in there, it's about conveyance. It's about moving that water through that floodway. So if there's something in the way and you're shooting water down there, it potentially could make the water rise. And that is going to impact the whole surrounding properties. So you need to do it in a way that it's not prohibited it's not prohibited in the floodway, but you just have to prove that it's not going to cause an increase and cause an issue on surrounding properties. So again, I kind of mentioned this by accident before, but stockade fences in the floodway, especially if they're perpendicular to the river, that could potentially that is certainly an encroachment, an obstruction. There are ways that you could do that. You could have them parallel, you could have it not be a stockade that water can go through it, or something that could be knocked over during a flood event. I did mention sewer and water systems before. Sometimes you cannot, you have to have the septic systems above grade, so you have to bring in fill. That is something that would require an analysis because you're bringing in a certain amount of fill. And certainly watercourse alterations, again, are something that needs to be considered if it's in the floodway. Best course of action, don't put anything in the floodway. But if there is, there are stricter requirements in there. And certainly if you have a floodway proposal, we'd be happy to help you walk through that process as well. Again, so Alexandra can choose to hire an engineer to complete the analysis, or she can just choose to find another location outside of the floodway. And in the case, the parcel that we selected as the example, you can see that there's plenty of other areas that are outside of the floodway, still in the floodplain, still have to comply with the regulations, but don't have to deal with the floodway requirements. So on to development scenario number 5. All right, so this gets into more of subdivision and site plan proposals that planning boards may be dealing with. Just knowing for planning boards to know that what these requirements are in the ordinance, that for any houses that are being in a subdivision or retail commercial spaces and site plans, they are going to have to meet these requirements. But there's a couple of things that happen at the site plan and subdivision level too. So we have Madison Conway, the property owner and developer, is submitting a proposal to build a subdivision comprised of 30 lots on a parcel of 16 acres. Part of the property is located in a Zone A with a special flood hazard area. So again, Zone A's are areas where FEMA has not determined a base flood elevation. Question is will Madison be required to develop a base flood elevation for that special flood hazard area as part of her application? The question is yes or no. And the answer is yes. For the NFIP requirements, a community subdivision requirements include that all proposals for development greater than 50 lots or 5 acres must include base flood elevation as part of that. The sense is if this is a large development and there's a Zone A area with no base flood elevation, there needs to be some kind of development of the base flood elevation for those structures. So again, these are the requirements that you'll see in your subdivision and site plan regulations that we've had communities adopt. I know it's probably tiny. The planning board must review proposed developments to ensure all necessary permits are applied for. Again, that's in the ordinance. Item B is require that base flood elevation for those 50 lots or 5 acres. And C is they need to provide sufficient evidence for proposals in regards to minimizing flood damage, the public utilities, and adequate drainage as well. So for that property, actually, I should have gone back there. Since the floodplain only includes part of that area, the base flood elevation data would only be needed for those structures that are proposed in that Zone A area. If someone was to propose a development that included a special flood hazard area, but they have all of the structures proposed outside of that floodplain area, then there wouldn't be a need for a base flood elevation to be determined. The purpose of the base flood elevation determination is for any structures within that proposal that need to build to that to the standards of the ordinance. You need to know what that base flood elevation is. So again, that's a good approach, is to keep those properties outside of the floodplain and leave the floodplain area kind of as open space or recreation or conservation area. All right. So now we're into our last scenario.
Jen, it looks like there's a couple questions.
Yep.
So what if the new road goes through the zone A? I think this refers to the last slide of your last scenario.
Yep. So the ordinance really doesn't really get into roads themselves. It's mainly dealing with the buildings themselves, but certainly having a road above the base flood elevation is a wise move. I know during our flood events in 2006 and 2007, we had several areas of long dead-end roads that had a culvert or just were over topped with flooding, and people had no way to get out. So that is something that there is guidance on. I can follow up and provide that later. But that is having that access higher than the floodplain is certainly a good thing to do to prevent those access issues. And I see the other question too. The 5 acres refers to the special flood hazard area. The 50 lots or 5 acres, that's for the proposal itself. But the determination of whether you need to make that or not is whether or not you're going to be putting structures into the special flood hazard area. So the determination of 5 acres, 50 lots is regarding the entire property, not just the floodplain area. All right. So we'll get into our last scenario here. So Troy Mason is a property owner. He requests a variance to the elevation requirement for his structure because it will cost him several $1,000s to elevate the house to comply with the ordinance. Does the community grant the variance based on this personal hardship? It seems like a pretty simple question, but I know it's a difficult question because I've sat through some of these hearings before. Personal hardship is not considered an exceptional hardship as it relates to floodplain management variances. It must pertain to the property itself, just like other zoning variances. The floodplain ordinance is a life safety issue too. So I've heard people wanting to seek a variance because they're going to be the only house that's elevated and they're surrounded by everybody else's that's on the ground. You know, they want to put improvements in, they're going to be have to be elevated. There's been thoughts about getting a variance because it's not going to fit in with the neighborhood. I've heard a lot of reasons for variances, and unfortunately, there just really isn't a good reason to have variance, although I'm going to talk about one. But in general, you generally don't want to see variances issued in the floodplain. There has to be an exceptional reason why, and it has to be related to the land and not to the property owner themselves. I do have the caveat that I did include a section, an example of when a variance may be okay to do. But just to get into the details about the variance, so all the all the communities that have adopted the floodplain ordinances, all 93% of the communities have this additional variance criteria. And the communities, this variance criteria is nothing new. It's been in there since the communities have entered the program. It's a local decision, so your ZBAs are going to be the ones looking at it. FEMA has a really great guidance document about variances and the NFIP. It's a very helpful guidance. So if you have that occasion where you have somebody seeking to get a variance from the floodplain regulations, please reach out to me. I can provide that information. I can provide some assistance on that. So you're following the 5 variance criteria that the state already requires, and then there's this additional criteria in the floodplain ordinance that the ZBA also needs to account for when hearing variance appeals. If you do issue a variance, documentation is the community's only protection after a flood that causes damage. So if you issue a variance, that person gets flooded, just having that documentation on file as to explaining why you issued that variance is going to be extremely helpful. This is the additional language that goes along with it. The one thing to note, if you were to issue a variance from someone having to not elevate for some reason, it's not going to change their flood insurance rating. The flood insurance piece doesn't acknowledge variances. It's still looking at how that structure was built. So there's potential of higher premium for the property owner, regardless of the variance. So that's just the key that's included in this section that's in the ordinance. So with that, as I mentioned, there may be a time when a variance is okay. So this is a scenario that would apply. So again, Troy Mason property owner requests a variance to the elevation requirement for a proposed small low-cost shed. So it's not the structure. There's already a primary structure on the lot. They just want to put in a low-cost shed to store the lawnmower, start garden materials. It is located in a zone AE, but luckily outside of the floodway. So FEMA recognizes that sometimes it's not technically feasible for some of these low-cost accessory structures. And I'm not talking about ADUs here. I'm talking about, you know, these sheds from Home Depot, or sometimes a smaller detached garage as well, or a small agricultural structure. It's just not technically feasible to require these to be elevated. These types of accessory structures are considered non-residential because hopefully nobody's living in it, because then it would be considered residential. These are non-residential. Again, I mentioned before, you have 2 options with non-residential to meet the requirements in the ordinance. It either has to be elevated to the base flood elevation, or it has to be dry flood proofed. Dry flood proof generally will not work, especially if you have a garage or a shed. You're just not going to be able to keep it watertight. Elevating it up, again, usually not feasible, depending on how far up off the ground you have to get to that base flood elevation. So FEMA has this wet floodproofing technical bulletin, which gives guidance on certain conditions that have to be met for these structures, and pretty much says if the community is interested in allowing people to seek a variance for these, they can go for a variance, but there's certain criteria that have to be met as a condition of that variance in order to allow this to happen without meeting what's in the ordinance. Generally, it's called wet floodproofing. So if you have a low-cost structure, you're going to make sure it's anchored. You'll make sure that it's only used for storage, parking, access if it's a detached garage. It's going to have flood openings in it, so it's going to allow the water to go into it. So there are certain criteria. So this variance is something that they're recognized as a need sometimes. So they've allowed that to happen because you can't meet the spirit of the ordinance as it's stated, but you can still do other things to help protect that structure during a flood event. The other thing is that if you don't want to have that variance process, then you do have a lot of people that are seeking accessory structures in a floodplain area. You can add accessory structure language into your ordinance, which takes that criteria as a condition of a variance and puts it in the ordinance. So we put it in our new model floodplain ordinance that we released a couple years ago. So you can find it in there. Again, reach out to me if you have questions about that. All right, so a lot of the things that I talked about, a lot of the resources can be found on our website. I took these website links and put it on our planning and zoning page, which is where the slides are going to be and where the recording is going to be. So you'll be able to access a lot of the things that I talked about that we have on our website. So that wraps up with what I was presenting on. I saw that what's the situation for an owner who wants a single post-ground mounted solar system in a special flood hazard area? All right. So for single ground mounted solar systems, it falls into the category of making sure that any of the electrical components are above or protected from flooding. There is a permit requirement, and that's pretty much it. It's pretty minimum to meet those requirements. Certainly if it's depends on the zone. If you're in a VE zone in the coastal area, that could potentially cause an issue. If you're in a floodway, that could cause additional requirements to come into play. But it's usually just a permit and making sure those electrical components are up and above. What about those large wrapped hail bales that are stored in the field? Yes, yes. Storage in the floodplain, that's another issue. It is part of the definition of development, storage of materials. So that is something that needs to address. It's not an easy thing to answer. It's kind of a case by case basis, but yes, it's during a flood event, hay bales, just what people store in their yards, all can be debris that goes downstream and cause issues down the road. So that is something that needs to be addressed in some way. So I can get back to you on that, on the hail bale. I think Vermont dealt with that more so than I did during the recent floods or the past floods that we've had. So. All right, well, there is my contact information. Again, if you've had my contact information from OSI, I do have a new email address. I'm still getting my OSI emails, so don't worry if you don't get this, but I will be hanging out for just a little bit if anybody has any questions, but other than that, I appreciate your time participating in this webinar. We'll try to get the recording up and possibly in the next couple of days, so you'll be seeing that. And yeah, we'd love to hear your feedback on this webinar and future webinars, and we hope to see you again next month. Thank you very much.